I always believed that trust is the foundation of any relationship, especially here, in the land of endless highways and towering skyscrapers, where both of us grew up and first met. My name is Ethan, and hers is Ashley. I never imagined I'd one day be hunched over in the dim light of my own living room, obsessively trying to figure out what went wrong between us. Back in college, my friends said love is complicated. But when Ashley and I crossed paths at a student party, it seemed like we'd discovered something extraordinary and rare. Even now, I can still see that moment in my mind's eye. We collided near a long wooden table crammed with plastic cups filled with soda and punch. She laughed and apologized at the same time, her eyes flashing with humor when I nearly spilled my drink on her dress. Embarrassed, I mumbled an apology in return, blaming my clumsiness, and her laughter in that instant felt like an invitation into a world I never knew I wanted. From that evening on, we were inseparable, or so I believed. She was the most light-hearted, cheerful girl in the world, someone who could illuminate the darkest day with a single smile. She never made a fuss about trivial matters, and she got all my awkward jokes as if we were on the same wavelength. I guess I didn't notice back then that my tendency to brush off problems too casually might be hurting her, or that she might have silently endured certain things. We both graduated college, each following our own path. I went into IT, learning to code and aiming for a career in software development, while she set her sights on journalism, wanting to write insightful pieces on social issues. When we moved into a small apartment near the city center for better internet and easier commutes, every object in the apartment reminded me of us. Her framed posters on the wall, my scattered programming textbooks, the shared blankets we'd snuggle under at night. Many mornings I'd wake up, roll onto my back, and watch her sip her coffee at the tiny kitchen table, with her knees pulled to her chest, scrolling through the latest headlines on her laptop. Sometimes I'd pretend I was still asleep, just so I could quietly observe her for an extra minute. Each of those moments felt like discovering a small treasure. I was convinced I'd found my family in her. We didn't rush into marriage, but I secretly scanned local jewelry stores for engagement rings, waiting for the right moment and the right budget. Things changed once she began her internship at a well-known magazine. I was proud, beyond words, and she'd come home bursting with stories about the editorial office. Glass partitions, rows of laptops on communal tables, the hum of colleagues constantly on the run, and frequent briefings or PR events. She even took me along to a few themed dinners where I was introduced to some of her coworkers. Among them was a guy named Logan, tall, athletic, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd been popular his whole life. The quintessential all-American guy, complete with a broad smile. The first time I saw him, I found him slightly overbearing in his attempts to make an impression, but I brushed it off. After all, I trusted Ashley completely. What threat could he possibly pose? The days zipped by, and her internship neared its end. I noticed she spent more and more time at the office, working late nights, sometimes returning home too exhausted even to speak. Meanwhile, I stayed in, refining my code to level up my own career. Gradually, we slid into a silence that felt unsettling but that I tried to rationalize. She'd come home drained, with her mind elsewhere, and I'd ask if everything was okay. She'd say she was just swamped. We're finalizing articles, the editor-in-chief wants perfection. I believed it because it sounded plausible, and I figured prying wouldn't help. Quiet walls started forming between us, and I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was wrong. But a small, nagging voice whispered inside me that her repeated late nights weren't entirely about editorial deadlines. I shrugged it off, assuming she'd open up when she was ready. Of course, in hindsight, that might have been my biggest mistake. People get so tangled in their own silent issues that they sometimes seek solace in places they shouldn't. Maybe I should have pushed her to talk, but I didn't want to be the overbearing boyfriend. I simply let events take their course. One night, I remember waiting for her for hours. Usually, if she stayed late, she'd text me. But that evening, my phone stayed silent. The evening news came and went. The city's lights blinked outside, and it was close to midnight when I heard her key in the lock. She looked both exhausted and uneasy when she came in. I asked about her day. She mumbled something about an off-site meeting in another city that ran late. Her voice quavered, and her eyes kept darting away as she spoke. When I tried to pull her into a comforting hug, she gently pushed me away, claiming she needed a shower more than anything. Her distance stung like cold air slicing through me, but I convinced myself she was simply spent. I wanted to believe that explanation. When she finished showering, I invited her for tea, but she brushed me off, saying she had an early meeting. My brain buzzed with questions. Every muscle in me wanted to ask if there was someone else, but I held back, telling myself trust was more important than suspicion. It wasn't in my nature to accuse her without evidence. I grew up in a family that handled conflicts calmly, without shouting. I feared that demanding answers might drive her further away if, by some chance, my suspicions were all in my head. Yet the late nights piled up. She sometimes claimed she was crashing at her friend Melissa's place, so she wouldn't have to pay for a long late-night taxi ride. She repeated that her job was intense, that the editor needed final drafts, that everything was urgent. My best friend Jake, noticing how withdrawn I'd become, kept urging me to pay attention. "Something's off, Ethan," he'd say. "You can't just coast along, man." I'd shrug and mutter that every relationship has its rough patches, that we were just busy. Deep down, I felt my own words wobbling under the weight of unspoken fears. One Friday, I decided to meet Jake at our usual bar on the corner of 3rd and River Street. Ashley said she couldn't join because she had another work gathering and planned to see her parents afterward. Instinct told me this was yet another lie, but I forced a casual smile and told her I understood. In the bar, I drank more than usual, trying to quell the growing anxiety. My friends joked about sports and cars, but I was miles away, lost in mental pictures of Ashley texting someone else or walking under city lights on the arm of that tall, smiling coworker. Stepping outside to get some fresh air, I saw a couple kissing in the next parking lot. Something about it shook me. It reminded me of how spontaneous and carefree Ashley and I once were, sneaking kisses in busy streets without a care who saw. I wanted to call her, to hear her say, "Hey, babe," in that soft voice. I dialed, hearing my heart pound, but her phone rang and rang without an answer. I returned to my friends and left early, carrying a weight that made the night feel endless. By morning, she was gone, leaving only a note saying she had to visit her parents and that she was sorry for leaving so early. That note felt distant and cool, the handwriting somehow smaller than usual. Throughout the weekend, she scarcely replied to my messages. When she did, it was only to say, "I'm fine, be back Monday." I spent long hours staring at our living room, at the blanket on the couch that still carried her warmth, feeling like something precious was slipping beyond my grasp. Sunday afternoon, my anxiety rising, I even drove downtown to the magazine's building to see if things really were as hectic as she claimed. But the office was nearly empty, with only one faint light burning in a corner room. I circled the block, peering from across the street, but there was no sign of her. The longer I waited, the more frantic the scenarios in my head became. I pictured her quietly laughing at a table in some tucked-away restaurant with Logan, or in a hotel lobby, or in his apartment. I told myself I was acting like a private detective in a bad movie, but I couldn't help it. Suspicion was eating me from the inside out. When she finally came home that Monday, I tried to act calm, but I felt like a wound still bleeding. She set down her bag and muttered a basic greeting. I dared to ask if we could talk, but she dismissed the idea, claiming she was tired and needed rest. Every question I posed met a wall of exhausted excuses or irritated pushback. Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, and we fell asleep with our backs turned to each other. I noticed for the first time that she smelled different, someone else's cologne lingering on her jacket, or maybe I was just imagining it. Either way, I was too rattled to think clearly. Over the next few days, things got even worse. We barely spoke, and when I tried to break the ice over breakfast, she'd be in too much of a rush, mumbling about an urgent meeting. At night, she'd claim she had a meeting or a yoga class with friends. I felt not only alone but also vaguely embarrassed, as though I were the cause of a drama I hadn't asked for. I needed proof, real, undeniable proof that my suspicions weren't baseless jealousy. Eventually, I mustered the nerve to call Melissa, the friend Ashley claimed to be staying with on late nights. My attempts to sound casual were clumsy. Melissa was polite but baffled, confirming they hadn't hung out since some corporate event weeks ago. I hung up, cold dread sinking in. Ashley had lied again. My mind roiled with images of her slipping out to be with someone else. I lost sleep, turning scenarios over in my head. Was it Logan? Probably. I remembered his self-assured grin, the kind that hints at a man who rarely hears no. If she'd looked for excitement or attention, he was the perfect candidate. My emotions twisted into an ugly blend of anger, sorrow, and self-loathing. I spent hours scanning her social media, hunting for clues, but she was meticulous. Nothing revealing. In a final desperate measure, I asked a former coworker, someone who knew a few shady methods, to gather any info he could find about Logan. I felt both guilty and determined. I promised it wasn't about stalking, just closure. He managed to pull some public data. Logan lived on the far side of town in a fancy complex with security and a private parking garage. No criminal record, no big red flags. A typical up-and-coming professional. The details made my stomach churn. It all seemed like the perfect setting for an affair. I hit my breaking point when I convinced Jake to drive me to Logan's building one evening. I needed to know for sure. Jake was uneasy, saying this was borderline crazy, but he saw how tormented I was. So we parked inconspicuously and waited. Hours crawled by. Around 8 at night, a taxi pulled up, and Ashley stepped out. Seeing her silhouette under the streetlight, heart lurching, I realized my worst suspicions were true. She entered the building quickly, glancing at her phone before disappearing inside. Jake tried to calm me, but adrenaline rushed through my veins. We waited in tense silence, hidden in the car. At midnight, 2 figures emerged. Ashley and Logan. They walked side by side, his arm around her, and even from a distance I recognized the body language of intimacy. Seeing them together in the flesh was like being stabbed with a jagged blade. The scene moved in slow motion. Her leaning against him, his fingers brushing her hair, their whispered exchange. I lost the ability to think rationally. I flung open the car door, stumbling onto the sidewalk, with Jake trailing behind me, urging me to stop. They both turned, startled. Ashley's face went pale, and Logan's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance. I confronted her in a raspy tone. "So this is your late-night work? This is what I've been waiting at home for?" She froze, her eyes flicking between me and Logan, searching for words. He moved as though to put himself between us, and I snapped, telling him to shut it, that this was between me and her. My voice trembled with emotion I'd never shown before. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Ashley spoke in a shaky whisper. "Ethan, I didn't know how to tell you." The sorrow in her voice was almost harder to bear than if she'd been defiant. Logan tried to say something like, "Dude, we're adults, calm down," but I glared at him, cutting him off. Jake came up behind me, telling me we should leave before this escalated. I was too shattered to form coherent sentences. Ashley looked at me with tears in her eyes, murmuring, "I'm sorry." But her posture, leaning against Logan, told me she'd already made a choice. Jake gently but firmly coaxed me back to the car. My eyes never left her until the door slammed. As we pulled away, I couldn't process the heartbreak. I saw her in the rearview mirror, one hand over her mouth, Logan at her side. My throat felt like it was closing, my vision blurred with a swirl of fury and grief. After a few blocks, I made Jake stop the car, stumbling onto the sidewalk to gulp down cold air. My breath ragged. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and for a while we just stood there under the streetlights, not talking. In my mind, I kept seeing the moment of her stepping out of that building with him. We returned to my apartment, and I collapsed onto the couch. Jake lingered, concerned, but eventually left me alone with my thoughts. I spent the rest of the night sitting in darkness, half expecting her to walk through the door. But she didn't. By dawn, I knew one thing for sure. My life as I knew it was over. The illusions I'd clung to had died the moment I saw her leaning into someone else's arms. Morning arrived, but I didn't go to work. I called in sick, too defeated to craft a more detailed excuse. I just sat at the kitchen table, replaying my entire relationship with Ashley like a film on fast forward. The first time we met, our goofy dates, our college graduation, the moment we decided to move in together. Every scene was colored now by the realization that she had chosen another man. Around noon, I heard her key turn in the lock. My pulse pounded as she stepped into the kitchen. She looked hesitant, guilt etched on her face. Before she could speak, I said, "If you're here for your stuff, do it quickly." The bitterness in my voice startled me, because I'd never spoken that harshly to anyone, let alone her. She swallowed hard, insisting she wanted to explain. So I listened, though my heart raced. She said she never meant to hurt me, that it began as harmless friendship with Logan, blossomed into shared support, and then evolved into a full-blown affair before she realized what was happening. She used words like lost and confused, saying she felt ignored at home, that I was too busy with my own projects, and that Logan filled a void of attention she'd been missing. I asked why she never talked to me, gave us a chance to fix it. She replied that by the time she understood her own loneliness, she'd already grown close to him. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she spoke, but I was too angry and hurt to feel sympathy. It struck me that she was also blaming me, at least in part, for not seeing her needs. Maybe there was truth in that. I had thrown myself into work, trying to secure a better future for us. But betrayal is betrayal. I told her as much, my voice subdued but firm. She looked down at the floor, muttering that she regretted lying. An awkward silence followed. Finally, I asked the crucial question. "So, are you leaving for good? Or are you trying to stay here with me and fix this?" She said she didn't know. She needed time to figure out her feelings. She claimed she still loved me in some way, but didn't know if she could forget Logan. Hearing that was like a blade twisting in my chest. She actually wanted more time to compare us as though we were two competing offers. My pride flared at last. I told her that if she couldn't choose now, she should go. I refused to sit around waiting for her to decide which man she preferred. She cried, trying to reach for my hand, but I recoiled. My entire being shut down, a new, steely resolve shielding me from her tears. Nodding with trembling lips, she apologized again, gathered a few things, and walked out. I didn't watch her leave. The moment the door clicked shut, I kicked over a stool in frustration, my body shaking as if I were on the verge of screaming into the empty air. The rest of that day passed in a thick haze. I couldn't decide whether I felt betrayed, furious, or simply hollow. They all seemed to meld into one suffocating weight on my chest. Every inch of that apartment bore her presence. Her jacket on a hook, her hair tie on the bathroom sink, our photos from various vacations. It was like living in a museum dedicated to a relationship that had abruptly died. Night came, and for the first time in ages, I truly felt alone. I tried watching TV, tried reading, but my mind replayed the night I saw her with Logan. My phone lit up with texts from friends who wondered if I was okay. I responded with short lines, not ready to discuss the details. When Jake texted to see if I needed company, I turned him down, unsure if I could handle any conversation without breaking into tears. Eventually, physical and emotional exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep on the couch. I woke up hours later in a cold sweat, her name on the tip of my tongue, but she wasn't there. The next few days followed a grim pattern. I stayed home, occasionally venturing out for necessities, but mostly ignoring the outside world. I gazed out the window at the bustling city below, cars and people moving on with their lives, while mine felt stalled. I found Ashley's lipstick in a drawer, stumbled on receipts from meals we'd had together, discovered her shampoo in the shower. Each tiny item acted like a flash grenade, bursting with memories of when we still laughed over trivial things and planned for a future together. On the third day, Jake convinced me to crash at his place for a while. He reminded me that I didn't have to keep punishing myself in that apartment full of ghosts. I packed a bag, checking my phone constantly, half hoping she'd call. She didn't. At Jake's, we sat around with a half-empty bottle of whiskey. I told him everything, from the moment I started suspecting until the confrontation outside Logan's building. He listened in sympathetic silence, occasionally offering a curse word or a sad nod. His advice was painfully simple. If she chooses someone else, let her go. You can't hold on to a person who isn't really yours anymore. I knew he was right, but hearing it hurt. For a long time, I'd pictured Ashley as my future wife, the mother of my children, my partner through thick and thin. Letting that go felt like an amputation. But the thought of staying in a relationship built on secrets and betrayal made my skin crawl. Even if she came back, how could I trust her again? Days melted together. Sometimes I cried in private so Jake wouldn't see. Sometimes I stayed awake all night, blearily trying to code on my laptop, focusing on lines of logic I normally enjoyed. My boss's texts went unanswered, until I finally told him I needed extended leave for personal reasons. He surprisingly agreed without much fuss, maybe out of concern. Slowly, I understood my life had to move on, but the how remained murky. Eventually, I forced myself to return to the apartment. I couldn't hide at Jake's indefinitely. Walking through the door, I noticed it was exactly as I'd left it, except for a short note on the counter. "I've taken only the essentials. Don't worry, I'll pay my share of rent and bills until we figure things out. I'm sorry for everything. A." My eyes scanned the note again and again, but I felt numb. She might as well have scribbled the end on a script that used to be our life. I spent hours that day sorting her remaining items into boxes. Bits of clothing she'd overlooked, a couple of books on journalism, a photograph or two. Each item had once been an ordinary part of our home. But now each stung like a wasp, reminding me of what I'd lost. I came across a framed photo of us in Miami from years back, both beaming under a bright sun. With trembling hands, I placed it in a drawer, hoping one day I could look at it without this crushing sense of loss. Days turned into a couple of weeks, and I found myself in a strange emotional limbo. Sometimes I felt relief knowing the lies had ended. Other times, I was overwhelmed by sadness so intense I could barely breathe. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering her nighttime laughter or the way she'd nestle her head on my shoulder during a movie. And just like that, it would strike me all over again. She chose someone else. She sent a few messages during that period, tentative check-ins, offering to talk calmly or discuss what happened. I seldom replied, usually leaving them on read or not opening them at all. I wasn't prepared to be her confessor or absolver. Part of me wanted to lash out, to text back, "You destroyed us." Another part of me missed her so fiercely that it felt like a piece of me had been cut away. Late one afternoon, the doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole. It was Ashley, holding a slim envelope. My pulse thudded and I hesitated. Finally, I opened the door. She handed me the envelope, saying it was some insurance paperwork she needed, and that she was sorry to bother me. There was an air of finality about her. I took it without meeting her gaze. She lingered, as if searching for an opening to say more, but I offered none. She whispered another apology. I said nothing. Then she left. I stood in silence, the envelope in my hand, feeling equal parts anger, sorrow, and longing. Over time, my moments of clarity increased. I reminded myself that this heartbreak, no matter how awful, could be a catalyst to discover who I was without her. I took baby steps towards self-care, going for runs in the early morning, listening to motivational podcasts, forcing myself to cook proper meals. The apartment still felt empty, but day by day, the emptiness started feeling more neutral than agonizing. I returned to work, focusing on tasks as if my life depended on it. It was my way of not thinking about her. Even so, thoughts of Ashley intruded at random. I'd glance at the clock, half expecting a text from her about dinner plans. I'd see a coworker's girlfriend drop by with lunch and feel an ache in my chest. Whenever these moments hit, I'd grit my teeth and remind myself of the scene I witnessed, the undeniable proof that she'd chosen someone else. It stopped me from caving to illusions. Friends kept inviting me out, trying to lift my spirits, but I still felt out of place in social settings. Conversations about trivial topics left me cold. I was grateful for their warmth, yet felt like I was observing from behind glass. They encouraged me to try dating apps, but the idea made me nauseous. Everything was too raw, too soon. I wasn't ready to open up again, not while the memory of her betrayal still festered like an open wound. And then, on a normal Wednesday evening, I received a text from her, longer than the previous ones. She said she understood she'd hurt me in ways words couldn't mend, and that she was sorry. She mentioned she and Logan had decided to slow down, that things weren't as simple as she'd thought. Reading that, a mix of irony and despair flooded me. She seemed to be implying she might consider coming back. I felt anger flare up. She'd broken us, walked out, and now wanted to revisit me. Perhaps because her fling wasn't panning out perfectly? I typed a reply, deleting it multiple times. My final message was brief. "I'm glad you're figuring out your life. I don't think we should talk right now." It took every ounce of willpower not to add more, to refrain from diving into the swirl of bitterness in my chest. Her response never came, which was probably for the best. Still, her text left me unsettled. I realized that in spite of all the pain, I wasn't immune to the idea of forgiveness. There was a part of me that yearned for a chance to fix things. But the flash of logic in my mind reminded me of how trust, once broken, doesn't simply snap back into place. The illusions of perfect harmony were gone. Even if we tried to patch things up, that memory of her with Logan would always be there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I looked around the dark apartment, illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights, and recognized how much I'd changed in just a few short weeks. Everything was in flux. My perceptions of love, my sense of self, my boundaries. I thought back to the sweet illusions I'd held, my plan to buy her a ring, our possible future. It felt like a dream from another era. I grasped that I needed to move forward alone, at least for now, and that no half measures or conciliatory gestures would heal the gash left by her betrayal. Time has a strange way of giving perspective. In the following weeks, I found myself able to remember certain happy moments without the immediate stab of loss. A memory would float by, her attempt to bake cookies in our tiny oven, or a silly argument about whose turn it was to do laundry, and I'd feel a warm, nostalgic ache instead of that soul-crushing emptiness. I still struggled at times, especially at night, but I began to see glimpses of a future where I didn't define myself solely by her absence. I started going to a gym with Jake, channeling my frustration into lifting weights. It felt surprisingly good to push my body, to feel tangible strength while my emotional core still felt bruised. Jake said he noticed a change. I was joking around more, occasionally smiling in a way that didn't look forced. It was gradual, but real. The apartment slowly transformed. I got rid of certain items that carried too many associations: old pillows, a throw blanket we'd bought together, trinkets from our travels. Not out of spite, but to clear the space, to make it fully mine. I rearranged the furniture and brought in a few new things, testing out a different color scheme. It was a small but symbolic act. I was reclaiming this environment, forging a fresh identity in the aftermath of heartbreak. I also ventured back into my coding with renewed focus, often staying up late to learn new frameworks or refine my existing projects. While before I saw coding as a route to a comfortable life for the two of us, I now embraced it as a personal passion that gave me a sense of control and worth. I had a serious talk with my boss, explaining that I'd gone through a rough patch, but was now ready to step up. He accepted my explanation and gradually loaded me with challenging tasks. Working hard distracted me from the lingering pain. Every now and then, people asked about Ashley. Some had seen photos of her and Logan on social media, nothing overtly romantic, but enough to confirm they were still in contact. I learned to respond with calm neutrality. We're not together anymore. I'm doing fine. If I said it often enough, it started feeling true. One late afternoon, while leaving the office, I spotted Ashley in the crowd across the street. It caught me off guard. My breath hitched. She was alone, lost in her own thoughts, wearing a coat I didn't recognize. For a split second, I considered walking over, but I froze. Part of me wanted to ask how she'd been, to see if there was any regret in her eyes. Another part wanted nothing more than to avoid reopening the wound. So I stood there, letting the swarm of pedestrians pass by, until she disappeared around a corner. In that moment, I realized I was still healing. Approaching her might only drag me back into emotional turmoil. That evening, a profound sense of closure washed over me. I recognized that I might never get a perfect resolution. No neat bow wrapping up our story. Sometimes, relationships simply end, leaving behind frayed edges and unanswered questions. I also understood that letting her go didn't negate the love we once shared. It simply acknowledged that our paths had diverged. I'd cherish the good times and learn from the bad. That was all I could do. I became more social after that revelation, accepting invites to group dinners or game nights. I started engaging again, even cracking jokes. A part of me had awakened, eager to explore life without the shadow of betrayal looming overhead. I wasn't over everything. That would be a lie. But I no longer felt stuck. Gradually, I reconnected with sides of myself that had been dormant. The me who used to love hiking trips, late-night drives, or spontaneously trying new foods. During my years with Ashley, I'd poured so much energy into the relationship that certain individual interests had atrophied. Now, reacquainting myself with them was both freeing and bittersweet. I realized how important it is not to lose oneself in someone else, no matter how strong the love. In the months that followed, I'd have moments of sadness. Of course I did. Healing is never linear. On random days, I would long for her laughter, or the gentle way she used to stroke my hair. I'd see something that reminded me of our shared jokes and feel a sharp sting. But I learned to let those moments pass, like clouds drifting across the sky. Jake was a constant support, reminding me that my capacity to feel deeply is a strength, not a weakness. He nudged me to consider dating again, but never pushed. He sensed I needed time. Meanwhile, my circle of acquaintances grew, largely through work-related networking and new coding communities. I found myself immersed in projects that expanded my skill set and introduced me to interesting, driven people. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuine excitement about the possibilities of my own future. Occasionally, I heard snippets about Ashley. Someone had seen her at a journalism panel, or she posted an article about social issues that got a lot of traction. I felt a detached pride, remembering how passionate she'd always been about writing. I hoped she was growing in her career and discovering what truly made her happy. Still, I kept a boundary. I wasn't ready for friendly chats, or to slip back into any kind of dynamic where unresolved feelings might bubble up. During a quiet weekend, I opened a box of keepsakes that I hadn't touched in months. Inside, I found photos, letters, little trinkets from the early days of our relationship. I flipped through them, expecting a surge of anguish. But instead, I felt an odd mixture of warmth and acceptance. Yes, it hurt, but it also reminded me that even though our love story had ended painfully, it hadn't always been doomed. There had been genuine joy. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were tears of release, not despair. I carefully placed everything back, deciding I wasn't ready to throw any of it away. Maybe later, or maybe never. It was part of my history now. Time continued to flow. Step by step, I built a life that no longer revolved around the pain of her betrayal. I started going on casual dates, though awkwardly at first. It felt strange to hold someone else's hand, to share stories about my life that once centered on Ashley. But it was a start, a reminder that my world could keep expanding. I never forced anything, just stayed open to the idea that life is full of surprises. I learned valuable lessons through the heartache. I discovered that trust, while fragile, can be rebuilt, if not with the same person, then with someone new. I realized how crucial it is to communicate needs and feelings before they fester into resentment. Above all, I found that one's sense of self should never hinge entirely on another person. Love is meant to enrich your life, not replace it. Even now, I have occasional bad days. Memories still surface, sometimes unexpectedly, like a scar that aches in cold weather. Yet each time it hurts a little less. I've grown from the experience, forging a stronger understanding of my own boundaries, desires, and emotional resilience. When I think back on the night I saw Ashley and Logan together, my heart still tightens, but I also feel a certain release. That moment was devastating, but it served as a harsh, necessary truth, catapulting me out of denial. Facing betrayal head-on forced me to confront my own shortcomings and illusions. It hurt more than anything I've ever gone through, but it also paved the way for a deeper, more honest relationship with myself. I'm not sure where Ashley's path led her. Maybe she found happiness with Logan, or maybe they broke up. Maybe she's thriving in her career, diving into investigative journalism, traveling across the country. I no longer feel the urge to know every detail. It's enough to recognize that we had a chapter together, and that chapter is now closed. Life doesn't always grant neat endings or comforting explanations. Sometimes we just have to accept the shards of what was and move on. Today, I wake up in a room that's fully mine, in a life that I'm shaping with my own decisions and dreams. The pain isn't gone, but it no longer dictates my every action. If anything, it's molded me into someone more cautious but also more aware of what I want and deserve. The city lights still sparkle at night, the highways still stretch endlessly beyond the horizon, and I move forward, step by step, ready to embrace whatever the future holds.